All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So again, if you're trickling in, please feel free to introduce yourself through the chat. Welcome everyone. I see the folks that are introducing themselves, and we're pleased to have you join us this morning. Now we're gonna go to the next agenda item, which is our trauma campaign progress. So I'll pass the mic to Emily Griffey, the real one.
Yeah, official. I would blue check would be. So wanted to remind folks on where we've been for the trauma campaign over the last years and in and out of the regular sessions, special sessions, what were the final results? So when we look back at what we had proposed at the beginning of 2020 for our trauma campaign agenda and what was included in our trauma campaign agenda, we see here some of the initiatives that finally made it through the end of the session and governor signing, and some initiatives that were eliminated. If you can't remember all of the details of these, we don't have to go through all of the details of these. There's folks on here from different organizations that represented them, but these pieces are things that move forward. So we did have some progress on fact funding tied to a different bill around the casino local referendums to proposed casinos. Some reinstatement of the healthcare priorities that were also shared by the HAVE Coalition around our famous moms coverage and coverage for legally residing immigrants. The language there starts those in 2021. Progress significantly to include the full funding for the Virginia Mental Health Access Project, collaborating with pediatricians and primary care providers, additional funding for mental health provider reimbursement through Medicaid, some funds to scale up those evidence-based practices to implement Family First and the behavioral health enhancement. And something that was on our agenda but was responded to in a much bigger way during the special session are the economic stability supports, including expanded eviction moratoriums, utility shutoffs, and then at the federal level, additional unemployment insurance net benefits. So new ways that we didn't even imagine at the beginning of the year how our economic stability might be impacted. I saw one question about the casino revenue, and that all depends on, so I think 4 of the 5 localities had ballot referendums, but not Richmond City, on their this past recent election approving casinos to be built. So the timing of that all depends on how fast they're built, when they're up and running, how the localities are awarding those contracts to a specific casino. So that's to be determined. I'm going to estimate 2 to 5 years on that process, potentially for the casino revenues. And then given 2020, with a large caveat of a long time and how plans come into place. The other unfortunate situation then this year was that once they took another look at the budget, they unallocated funds or did not restore funds. So in this impacted these areas listed in black on the right-hand side. The ACEs interface training did not have funding restored. The home visiting expansion through Medicaid did not. We had put tracking school-based health centers on our agenda, but nothing ever really came of that during the session. The student support personnel, including counselors and social workers and school psychologists, the counselors were eliminated and the additional support personnel were not additionally increased. And some targeted salary increases for social services caseworkers were not included either. So we have here, the end of result of where we hope to be in 2020, a little bit of a mixed bag, right? And we have now much greater challenges that our communities and children are facing. So wanted to pause here, I think that's the next slide, Chloe, and say, given and open it up for folks to pop in, either in the chat if you feel comfortable unmuting. Hopefully a few folks will unmute and chime in here. how do you describe, how do you feel about this progress to date with our trauma campaign? What does seeing that list of movement and some things eliminated or paused, how does that make you feel today? That's my questioning owl face there. Go ahead, feel free to unmute yourself.
Well, Emily, I think I would say that, it was a powerful reminder of all of the initiatives that we were hoping for. I mean, I was going to sort of start there, that I think it was, it really reflected the partnerships and assessments that we had done about where we could make a significant impact. Certainly I saw where chronic absenteeism is one of the agenda items, and there's certainly a number of these that have, relevance to that. But I think the big piece is obviously is that, within the context of the pandemic, that, we were able to maintain or increase some things, and obviously the things we were not were critical, as it related to school support staff, and the issues around retention of caseworkers, and some of that being linked to salary. So I guess the overall feeling is one of I guess gratitude for those things that were maintained or salvaged, but certainly I guess a commitment to looking again at those that were not, and what that path forward might look like in our current context, and other priorities that have merged or have emerged or reemerged that have implications for all of this, i.e. the important work of racial equity and justice. So, yeah.
Thanks, Janine. That's good pros and cons, right, of that list. Anyone else have thoughts that they want to share?
Emily, this is Mary Beth. I wonder, as we're thinking about how we feel about the progress, if you could go back and address when our communities are going to start to feel some of these things. A couple of the items had like an April date. Someone asked in the chat about when might the casino revenue begin. So like, as we think about the work with the pediatricians, for instance, when does that start? When can our community start benefiting from those things?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. And I tried to clarify some of that with those notes, that obviously the time frame here depends on what money was included in the current fiscal year, what money was included in the next fiscal year. So some things like VMAP are intended to begin now, but this passage of that and the starting of that may just depend on how quickly state agencies can get these things up and running and expanded, essentially. And then with this coming General Assembly session, still will deal with the budget starting in July 2021. So that's our FY22 budget, and some things were restored already by the General Assembly for July 2021, and some things will be revisited during this short General Assembly session. So it's all, unlike most years where the timing is pretty clear cut, the parameters are pretty clear cut, this year is just, I think, a little bit different in terms of how it feels as a moving target. So I know seeing that list, again, we'll hopefully, if you want to look back at that list, we'll have it for you, and you can look at it in the PowerPoint. We'll have more information. And we wanted to kind of switch. I think Mary Beth here is one of the questions for you to prompt around, thinking about this list and where we are and the moving target of 2020. what will folks say about this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's one of the best parts about partnering, right? And this group that came together this morning and the group that's coming together around racial truth and reconciliation and all of our community groups, these aren't just lists, right? These aren't just a policy idea. This is somebody's life, right? And so as we think about what we were able to salvage of this year and what we need to do moving forward, the General Assembly wants a list, even though it's, really about real life. How would you describe the needs for kids and families today? And are their needs being met by what we accomplished so far this year? And if it's yes, let's super celebrate that. And if it's no, let's name what needs to be done.
So it seems like part of what this pandemic has done is really put a magnifying glass over a lot of really broken pieces that have been around forever, I think nationally and at the state level too. But it seems pretty obvious to me that we're kind of shifting into more of like kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs at this point, that we have kids in Virginia, a lot of kids in Virginia that don't have enough food to eat. We have kids that don't have access to broadband access, which means they can't go to school in many areas of the state. We have eviction issues where they don't have safe and stable housing. So I think that kind of maybe making the connection between some of those issues that historically hasn't been the focus of a lot of our work, and maybe historically has been the focus, but it's a good time to kind of circle back around to that, and to not pretend like it's not happening, because it's just an incredibly critical time, I think, for survival for a lot of people.
Can I ask a clarifying question? I guess I'm a little confused as to what lens we're talking about. How will we describe the need for kids and families today? I think that's a very broad question, and I think it would be helpful for me to narrow down exactly what lens are we talking about. And I think that sort of goes to what Nicole was just saying. It's like, I think it's just really hard for me to even conceptualize that, right? Because those needs can be so varied. Are we talking about medical needs? Are we talking about housing needs? Are we talking about, food and clothing? And are we talking about cultural needs? I don't know, but I think that's just really hard for me to think about it in a vacuum.
I think that's a great point, because we've resumed some in-person with meetings with students, and it's totally different in person, especially because when we're doing the e-mentoring through Zoom, we know that parents are just an earful away, and kids that would normally share things about their safety and concerns aren't willing to do so via Zoom. So I think that those are both Nicole and, I'm sorry, I didn't see who was just speaking. I think those are very valid points. What lens are we looking at this through? And now that schools are out, how do we gain access to really assess what the needs are of students that have experienced primary and secondary trauma?
So this is Mary Beth. I wondered if I could jump back in and say all of the lenses at today and at this stage, it's everything, and it needs to keep being everything. And so Ms. Speaker, I'm sorry that I can't sort of narrow it down. I want it to be everything for you right now. I think our General Assembly, it's certainly growing and changing in terms of their embracing of their roles. But we're coming off decades and decades of a General Assembly with an attitude of, I have a very small role, I meet for 45 days, don't ask too much of me. They've got to get some help breaking out of what they think the lens is too. And so I think that's part of what we're trying to get at, right? And they want to get out in and out in 45 days. Well, we've got more than 45 days worth of need to address. And anyway, so I'm countering your need for narrowing it down by saying no, don't. Let's let it be all of those things, and then we'll keep working together to get those things heard.
So part of the
sorry. Go ahead, Chloe.
Well, part of the goal of the campaign for Trauma Informed Virginia is to look through a lens of trauma informed care, and now we're beginning to move forward and weaving equity more intentionally into that lens. But part of what we'll go into a bit later today is the concept of intersectionality and how all of the perspectives that we bring to the table are so important. And by increasing and expanding those perspectives, we're able to hopefully mitigate some of the biases that often contribute to quality. So it's very important for all of us to bring our lenses and perspectives to the table in shaping this year's policy agenda and the policy agendas moving forward to hopefully mitigate some of those biases and represent all of what the children of the Commonwealth of Virginia experience.
Add this, and I hope this makes sense, but what I have been seeing, I don't know if this is positive or negative, you all can tell me, but I've been seeing that some families who have experienced adversity in any capacity in their lives, sometimes generationally, are equipped with a bit more resilience than some families who have never experienced adversity, and they're pulling together their community in unique ways that can be replicated and funded in ways that we haven't approached the work of how we work with children and families. And so that's something I've been pondering the last couple of months of like, okay, we have these communities that we typically kind of over surveillance, and we don't associate how they have survived through trauma in different ways. But I think there's an opportunity to say, this community has done this, why can't we invest in this methodology? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think maybe if I could ask, so another point is that what I'm assuming we're trying to do here is view these issues that have historically been viewed through a trauma-informed lens by adding on a racial equity lens in which we're looking at these different issues. Is that correct?
Ultimately, I can say that's partially that is the direction we're moving in, is looking in parallel at the inadvertent impact of cultural, racial, and historical trauma in a more intentional way, which is what we'll kind of dabble into a bit later. But historically, when you're looking at all traumas or trying to serve all children, often the communities that are marginalized are not in parallel viewed the same or attended to the same way. So we have to be intentional when we're looking at combating cultural, racial, historical trauma and how racism is perpetuated within our systems.
I think I got out of this the idea that what we're talking about to describe the needs of kids and family is that they are intersectional. They do hit on stability, resilience, race, economic supports, geographic differences, and that, in order to address the holistic needs, that we need to have a multi-pronged approach to do that. And that the lenses that we wear are all of the lenses too, and able to do that. So I think everybody hit on some of the truths here. Chloe, I do want to keep us moving to talk about the next pieces so we can go into more of what might be ahead this year. We wanted to also go back, and we also wanted to raise some of the issues that we know will be, we're working on different intersections with our partners in other coalitions, including the Resources in Schools with the Fund Our Schools Coalition, food access and security with the Food Access Coalition. Shout out to Salam on here, and let's see, who did I see any LAJC and TCI folks on from Fund Our Schools. The healthcare issues with the Healthcare for All Virginians Coalition, and the economic supports, including the Paid Sick Days Coalitions, Family Economy Virginia, Eviction Moratorium, the economic supports. There's more to come. I think the other truth of this year that we talked about, the moving target, the 45 days not being enough to solve the crisis, is that we're also a little bit behind where we would normally be in trying to have a proactive policy approach. We're all just a little bit reactive in this space, I think, and trying to best sort out what is next. And so I imagine some of the issues that might come up this session, we might react to, which is why we put on this agenda having a conversation about something like chronic absenteeism, where we know there'll be multiple ways to address it, and that there's some immediate sort of reactions to what happens when kids are not attending in school. We want to maybe have the conversation of thinking about how are we going to be prepared to react to that, so that our initial reactions are not as reactive, that they are looking from these multi-pronged lenses that we all mentioned here. So the other things that we've looked at in terms of continued funding, continued support, the things that didn't make it all the way in terms of additional trauma-informed initiatives are what we bucketed under community level prevention last year. The funding for implementation of the Family First Prevention Services Act, and funding for how our FACT, the Family and Children's Trust Fund, can continue to support communities and TICNs. And Allison, Valerie, Nicole, if you all, Fallon, anyone want to say anything else about these topics here, about what might be on your radar for this upcoming legislative session?
I can just quickly say that some of you are on the Foster Care Policy Network, and we do want to continue with trying to get money reallotted. I don't even know if that's the word we should use anymore. Just money for the implementation of Family First. We got a teeny bit of money to do for services, but what was allocated originally is really what we need to fully do Family First. We can't just do it with what the federal government is needing. We need the state match. The other part of that, as we had more conversations about equity, we also talked about the need to expand our approach a bit. There are certainly programs that are not within this federal clearinghouse for where families can be referred, or families and children can be referred for services. And so we also wanted to expand that ask, and that gets a little bit into the tick-in money around, we really need money for community-based programs that more families of color would more likely to utilize. But if anyone wants to add to that.
Allison, I think that's a good summary. I would just add that, it is so important that the services be accessible in community sources and not through the government sources for so many families who rightly or wrongly, but often very rightly, don't trust what the government does to help because of the history that the government has had and the way in which it helps. But also to your point earlier about how communities have created their own resources that serve them well. The General Assembly this year created a prevention committee that is looking at, what's called prevention of child abuse or neglect. I still have a problem with calling it that, but that's where we are. But at that point, I think is starting to come across that the Department of Social Services is not necessarily the best avenue through which to provide services to families when it comes to prevention. And hopefully FACT can be one of the ways that we can keep pushing that. And part of that hopefully will come through the casino funds. I think the casinos are going to be built, but they have to be built first before we can see any funds from them. So it will be a while and we can't rely on it. I do think that part of the problem with the General Assembly is, as Mary Beth noted, that, you know, they think for this year and they think for, you know, the following year, and that's pretty much it. And part of that is because of it's election cycle driven. And part of it is because they have a responsibility to that budget. They don't have a responsibility to the future. That's how they view it. We're the ones who view the future. And so we're going to have to be creative, and it's going to be very hard during this time. And I don't have any wisdom about that.
So just to kind of piggyback on everything with regard to FACT, we certainly wish we could get more money because to give to the communities. I think it does. I think that there's a really strong opportunity for FACT to really start working within the scope of this prevention plan that Valerie referenced, that's in the process of being developed with regard to primary prevention, because I think everybody just is echoing a lot of folks, but that, you know, the issue of really working, empowering communities to kind of, you know, develop and support their own methods of helping families is a really effective way at providing a lot of these services. And that's, you know, generally a lot more culturally sensitive and effective than if we do it in Richmond through government. So just to that end, you know, I'm kind of often discussing the limitations of the funding available for Virginia through the Children's Trust Fund, which FACT is. But we have pulled out a tiny bit of reserve funding, and those of you working within TICNs have heard me talk about this, but that this FACT emergency fund has been developed by the Board of Trustees at FACT, which is small, like basically cash grants to TICNs for cash for families during this time, you know, to assist in whatever resources they need that isn't available to assist them at this point. It's really limited. It's, you know, as I said, $5,000 grants, it's $50,000 in total, but that's the type of thing that, like, the reason we designed it this way is to really give a community or these community networks an opportunity to design a process where they can, you know, touch families in a way that's beyond just public awareness and education. So, you know, that's just a tiny little pilot program that we're doing, but I think that that's a really good example of kind of us where we're starting. We've talked in the past, a lot of you are familiar with the family resource model. I think that that's a really great model for us to look at and examine with regard to this prevention plan. And that's a role that, you know, FACT could be really helpful in helping to establish those, and the TICNs are a perfect, you know, kind of existing structure that we have in Virginia. So there's a lot of potential. The issue is there isn't a lot of financial support, and because there isn't a ton of research around this stuff, it's hard to make the argument, I think, particularly during this time. But I still think it's worth talking about, because I love what Allison said. I think that's just a fantastic way of looking at this issue. And I would love to see some efforts put forth in kind of telling some of those stories of resiliency in communities, so we can help people understand that this is really what we're talking about when we're talking about a strength-based perspective. So anyway, yeah, I will try and post the application. If not, I'll send it to Emily to send out to everybody on this call. It's on our website. Actually, it's not on our website yet. But it's been sent out to all the TICNs. So we'll get that out to you today.
Thanks for sharing that, Nicole. And I think Ali or Lisa, if you want to add anything about the prevention plan, you know, what I was hearing as a theme is that we've talked about like the artificial timelines of the General Assembly and moving targets of the year, but the prevention plan is something that can kind of span those timelines potentially. Lisa or Ali, do you want to add anything about that?
Yeah, and I think going into that, I'll just say, good morning, everyone. This is Ali Farouk from Families Forward. I would say, obviously, the big takeaway is we've all said over and over in 100 different ways is that we still have to do a better job of making the case to the General Assembly, especially the many committees, about the importance of prevention, not just as, oh, it's a good idea, wouldn't it be a nice thing to do, but that if we're really serious about actually taking a bite out of some of these problems, we have to start shifting the system towards more prevention and making that a priority. In terms of prevention plan, we believe that's a critical part of making that case to all the right partners at all the various agencies, because we want to have all parts of state government, not just the advocates, but the key agencies and the key members on the money committees that they work with regularly, to start hearing the same message that, hey, we need to shift our system more towards prevention. Hey, here's the places where, you know, even what little dollars you have could make a big difference. And that includes, you know, facts, that includes some of our community funding for things like home visiting, of course, obviously the crucial investments in Family First. That's some of my takeaway. The plan is moving. You know, I think a lot of you have been in some of those meetings. I think we're still figuring out exactly what our language is, but overall, I think it's going better than I expected. Doesn't mean it's perfect, but they are chugging forward and we feel good about it. But I'll open it up to Lisa if she wants to say anything.
Yeah, I think one of the things that state government has to accept, and, you know, hopefully this discussion about the prevention plan will help, is that there are certain roles that don't work for state government. And, you know, obviously prevention services are one of those, but the state agencies have to get to a point where they can say, and, you know, social services is a prime example of this, but it also fits with, you know, some of the others, that our job is not primary prevention. You know, their job is child welfare, and that, you know, while we really want to change social norms so that people know that everybody needs help at some point, and it's the strong parents who ask for help. Anybody who's going to ask for help from that perspective isn't going to go to DSS in, you know, their community and knock on the door and say, hey, I need some help, you know, with my 3-year-old who's making me crazy. You know, so I think that's one of the things that we have to help them understand, that it's okay. You know, we on the community level, you know, and other places in the nonprofit sector, we don't expect them to fill that role. We do expect them to look at how they are investing resources and see if there's some that could be reallocated. And that is one of the things I think it's really exciting about the fiscal mapping of all money being invested in children's services, 0 to 21, that we're just getting started on, because that will identify, you know, things like, you know, okay, CB cap could be used very differently. And, you know, how does that fit in, you know, as one of the funding sources that actually could support primary prevention. And so I think there's hope, but I also think that, you know, it's a good time to be doing this work, just because we know that with all the transitions with the next governor, it will be helpful to have things in place that we can hand them.
So the timing of this conversation is, we're moving into the General Assembly session where we think we might have to be a little bit more reactionary. The prevention plan will really be a guiding post for the future beyond that point into the next administration, the next legislative session. Is that kind of sums up the timing here,
right? Because
can I just jump in really? Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Fallon.
Oh, I was just going to say the one piece that I was going to add that I don't think Valerie and Allison had mentioned was when we were having this conversation, we were talking about an idea of thinking about what resources are needed, right? We recognize the issues that oftentimes these communities, the most marginalized communities, aren't willing or comfortable with going to DSS or those sort of state agencies for assistance. And then I think what we also talked about was, this is the piece I don't think was mentioned, was like getting a better understanding of what those communities feel are resources that they need, right? And as opposed to going in and telling them what they need, or like, you know, just creating programs that we think they need, really getting a better sense from the community as to what could be helpful for them in terms of prevention.
Yeah, that's why the Family Resource Center model is so great, because it's community driven, not just community based.
Yeah, and it's great. And so I do want to get to our speakers too. So just one more update here on the other end of the coin, as we were talking about, you know, just talking about what's not appropriate for government to be able to do. Here are some things that might be appropriate for government to do. And so interested in folks' take on that based on where conversation we were just having. You know, the idea when starting the trauma campaign is that there would need to be some ownership and buy-in for this work at the state level, and that the governor's office and some interagency efforts needed to really own that, because trauma didn't fit in any one bucket, as neither does some of these issues of racial disparities. And so, you know, one of the proposals that we have been, working for a long time is to continue to have this idea of the governor's children's cabinet as a way for the interagency works to collaborate, for interagency initiatives to continue. And so we have been throwing out the ideas to continue the governor's children's cabinet with a full-time staff person to the Northam administration that they might consider including in their outgoing budget. So this would be a position that could then, looking forward, right, because nothing would take place here until July 2021, that a person could be named to be in place to start untangling where we've been in terms of the impact on children of the pandemic, untangling where we are in terms of the racial, cultural disparities that we have right now, and start to help to weave together a future that does look more hopefully at prevention too. So we are working on this idea to the Northam administration right now with the hope that they would include something in the outgoing budget. And so I encourage you all to, as you're having conversations with the governor's office folks, with state folks from the secretary's offices or others, to, if you support this idea, to include that as well. We hope to see something when the governor's budget would come out in December on this piece as a way to sustain and do some of those things that the communities can't do on their own, and we hope that communities wouldn't be expected to do on their own either. So I do want to keep moving so that we can talk a little bit about and then here are, if y'all remember, the statewide, state-driven programs to help and help people understand ACEs and trauma. There has been the ACEs interface training, and now what had been Vision 2021 is now called Virginia Heals, and that has launched. I know some communities, trauma networks have launched using the toolkit elements, the screening elements of that project to help address and identify trauma at the program level, at the community level through those efforts as well. There are two efforts, as I mentioned, with HEALS, or with the interface training was not continued funding, and the Virginia HEALS funding also ends this year as well. So we hope that some of those efforts will continue too. If you have any thoughts or feedback on those things, please feel free to share with me or to write something in the chat. I do want to keep us moving because I know I'm really excited for our discussion points, and Chloe has some updates to share on the Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia.
Great. Hello, everyone. For those who may not know me, my name is Chloe Edwards. I'm the Advocacy and Engagement Manager at Voices for Virginia's Children. Many on this call may have not been following our Racial Truth and Reconciliation initiative here at Voices, but I know that a lot of the trauma-informed community networks are familiar, so this may be a bit redundant for you all. Back in August, we witnessed the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color, particularly. And then we also witnessed the resurface momentum of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is it's much larger than police brutality. I've been referring to it as the modern civil rights movement as well, because it further looks at the impact of oppression, racism, et cetera, that has not been solved in America as a country or in Virginia as a Commonwealth. So I took this as, we have 27 trauma-informed community networks in Virginia. 5 are led by people of color in particular. And so I took it as an opportunity to do a temperature check with other fellow leaders of color in the trauma-informed care space, to just have a conversation about, one, do we want to respond to what is occurring? Oftentimes people of color in leadership positions do feel the natural inclination to need to respond. We carry the heavy weight of responding to issues that impact our communities. And so we had the conversation, and we did ultimately decide to respond to what was occurring in the state as well as the country. What we recognize is that we often look at all traumas, physical abuse, emotional abuse, etc. But the area that some are a bit more uncomfortable in are the inadvertent impacts of cultural, racial, historical trauma. And so we wanted a week that we just honed in on those traumas, ultimately the traumas that some may be a bit more uncomfortable with. But we saw the need to not just look at the world with a trauma-informed care lens, but also simultaneously an equity lens in a more intentional fashion. And so we launched Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week, which has transitioned into Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia, with a mission to empower marginalized communities and acknowledgement of truth to promote healing, reconciliation, and justice. The week really spread like wildfire. We did gain the support of all of Virginia's trauma-informed community networks, but it also expanded to the community as a whole outside of that target demographic. And so it's truly a community-led initiative where we establish the mission and goals of the week collectively within our trauma-informed community network leaders led by folks of color, but also within the events and the community chats that occurred, where we just had folks that extended their helping hands to highlight certain issues that are very important, like maternal and infant health mortality, food insecurity, et cetera, issues that particularly impact communities of color. So this is the mission and the goals that we collectively decided on. Not only does it recognize the concept of racial truth and the concept of oppression within, as far as identities goes, race and ethnicity, but also other communities that are also oppressed, like LGBTQ+, individuals with different abilities, individuals on the IDD spectrum, et cetera. We gained the support of the governor's administration, also gained the support of the governor's chief equity, diversity and inclusion officer, Dr. Underwood. The initiative was recognized at the statewide town hall on racial equity and police reform. We recognize that this issue is time sensitive. There's a lot of more momentum around Black Lives Matter and the concept of racial justice when all of these issues were occurring. And so we planned this within 1 month's time span. So we had 30 events ranging from community chats that targeted important topics such as community responses to Black Lives Matter and COVID-19, food insecurity, maternal and infant health mortality, et cetera. There were children's book readings that highlighted the concepts of diversity and inclusion from a child's perspective. One of the most powerful events was the Our Ancestors' Wildest Dreams series, where I got to interview my own grandmother who lived during the Jim Crow, when Jim Crow was a policy that was in action. And I interviewed my Uncle Ronald, who talked about the 1963 March on Washington, which also occurred here in 2020. But the other concept of that theme was the youth-led Q&A with the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus, where they highlighted important issues like cultural representation in politics and the plight of oppression that they had to overcome in order to sit in the seats that they do sit in, the rooms that they do sit in, and how they often have to represent entire communities of color when it comes to policy that will impact their fellow community members. So those are just a couple of examples. We gained the support of 37 partners in solidarity and over 13 public officials represented here. And so ultimately what this showed is not only do we have administrative support around this issue when it comes to the governor's office, but we also have legislative support and community support too, as far as the organizations and the community members that were represented, which was over 50 during the week. Since then, the initiative has just continued to grow. We have over 343 members that are part of the Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia Coalition. We did vote to become a coalition. We looked at wordage and what it means. And partnership often insinuates that only professionals or organizations can be represented. Collaboration insinuates that it could be professionals, but also community members represented. But what coalition insinuates, it's both of those, and also political goals, which we do have in order to accomplish our mission and goals. Our last meeting was on October 29th, which we had over 150 registered to attend the meeting. We also have broken out into committees: executive, engagement, education, partnerships, advocacy, and activism. The goal of the engagement committee is to build authentic relationships with youth and parent and family serving organizations. That is non-transactional. Education continues to highlight important topics that including professional development, personal development, but also policy goals. Partnerships is our partners in solidarity, who we hope will bring back the mission of goals of racial truth to their organizations and ignite change. And then advocacy and activism is gearing up to prepare for the General Assembly session and throughout the year to legislative opportunities, but also opportunities to ignite social change. We have a digital reach, including our social media, to again engage with different populations and demographics. We have a poll at each of our meetings to look at who's in the room and who's not. But all of our events are open to the public. And so Facebook is very engaged because that's the platform we use during Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week, but we're also spreading our expansion on IG and Twitter now, so you can follow us at Racial Truth. I'm pleased to introduce our executive committee members who will be leading the committees. We have our honorary members, which are the founding trauma-informed community networks. If you happen to be represented on this call, please introduce yourselves, your networks, and how folks can engage. And if you happen to be one of our executive committee members, please feel free to introduce yourself as well through the chat. But here are the folks that will be leading the change within our coalition, and the co-chairs of each committee, who are diverse and either have a strong background in the concept of trauma-informed care, equity, or community engagement. We also, to communicate, there is a transition between the Campaign for a Trauma-Informed Virginia and Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia. When we had conversations with Virginia's trauma-informed community networks, what we recognized is that there was a lot of attention on the concept of diversity and inclusion previously within our conversations, as well as the concept of equity. But there are still some challenges to implementation of that within the networks. And so what we collectively decided was that given today's challenges and the impact of COVID-19 on communities of color, as well as the modern civil rights movement, is that we have to be reactive, responsive to what is occurring in the communities that we serve. And so racial truth and reconciliation is ultimately the evolvement or the evolution of the Campaign for a Trauma-Informed Virginia, for us to intentionally promote both trauma-informed care, but also equity as a whole, and looking at the intersection between the two. not just recognizing what's happened to the communities we serve, but also identifying the root cause and how identities, race, and ethnicity influences the experiences of the community members that we serve. So we will have a joint advocacy day, the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Virginia, Racial Truth and Reconciliation Advocacy Day. We're recruiting a cohort of 15 youth, 10 parents, and 8 artists. We have engaged in some art activism in the past. And so if you know anyone that's interested in joining the cohort, or if you want to just simply spread the word, or if you happen to be interested, please look at the link on our website for the details to apply. We will ultimately.
Hey Chloe, it's Allison. Sorry. For help for folks who are thinking about people, can you give some context for the what the youth should be interested, or what parents should be interested in to participate?
Yeah. So ultimately, we're looking at for our cohort, individuals who have experienced trauma, lived experience of trauma, which of course can be on your adverse childhood experience scale that we're all familiar with from the Kaiser Permanente, experimental childhood trauma, but also looking at the way in which racial, culture, and historical trauma for folks who have experienced that as well, so oppression. We also are looking for individuals who have experienced Virginia's public systems. So this could be a kinship care parent, a foster parent from the parent perspective, but from the child's perspective, a youth up to the age of 25 who has experienced Medicaid, has used Medicaid, has experienced mental health services from their community service board, whose families may rely on EBT or cash assistance. So kind of looking at public systems as a whole, as far as for those would like to participate in the cohort. But I have been saying, if you have any questions on whether the person you're thinking of or yourself qualify to participate in the day, just don't hesitate to shoot me an email and ask, or feel free to pick my brain if you're looking at applying. But the link does have a lot more details as far as what we're looking for. And it will ultimately be a hybrid day. So we have our virtual campaign day, which will incorporate the legislative visits, but we're also planning MLK Day of Action, or reclaiming of MLK Day, which is very important because typically this day has been dominated by white supremacists who go to the Virginia General Assembly, and it's a day that we want to reclaim for the community. Some more details are in action as far as what that day will look like, but ultimately it's a hybrid day for folks who want to participate virtually, but also folks who want to have that sense of community and be with our fellow community members. It'll be similar to our Unity Walk back in August. So here's the deadline for applications is November 23rd. If we look at the end of the year at a glance and what it looks like for Voices, November and December are going to be strong advocacy training months, and we'll also be finalizing our policy agenda. There is an upcoming training on December 4th that will be hosted by Virginia Inclusive Communities on courageous conversations that are ultimately rooted in the concept of allyship, both for white people, but also people of color, because allyship looks different based off of your identity. So we'll be talking about both concepts and what it looks like for different communities and perspectives. Again, we'll have the MLK Day of Action, which is still in planning, and then the Advocacy Day, which will be on January 25th. One more day that is not on here because it just got published today is also December 14th. I'll be leading a training on racial, culture, and historical trauma. So I'll send out details to our listserv about that training too, which will be hosted by the West Piedmont Trauma Informed Community Network. Both are opening it up to the public for 100 slots.
a lot going on. I just wanted to add here, since we didn't talk about what we know or don't know about the General Assembly session this year, give Chloe a chance to have a breather and drink too. That we are anticipating that most of the action will take place virtually. Obviously, a lot of the parameters have not been set. Again, the theme of the continual evolving cycle of 2020, the evolution of the agenda is likely going to continue during this General Assembly session. So we're trying to use our best guess at some creative ways to get involved. And we really think that these opportunities for virtual visits are going to be really powerful with legislators, that we can go really directly to individuals, families, communities that don't always get a chance to take the whole day off and come to Richmond, or have the opportunity to navigate that space, to be able to be in a virtual visit with us. So we have a couple of opportunities to do that, including these through the RTR and trauma campaign. And so I think, if you are interested in doing that, if you want to be in this space, if you have folks that you've talked to that in the past that have been like, well, I can't come to Richmond for a whole day, this is their opportunity to really think about how to get involved and engage in a virtual space. So that is what we know right now. We anticipate to sort of be figuring things out as we go along, as it has been during the legislative session. The steps that you all took today to register, to get online, to now go into breakout rooms, et cetera, that we're doing today are going to look probably a lot like engaging during the legislative session. So just keep that in mind, help folks know that if you are helping folks as a helper in advocacy, you might have to help them navigate these spaces of Zoom and registration and being in and out of smaller groups for testimony and breakouts and things like that. So just putting that out there as what advocacy might look like this year. And that other concept that we've been talking about, advocacy this year, is probably going to be quite the marathon, not the sprint, not beyond the 45 days of the legislative session, throughout the year and throughout the gubernatorial campaign as well.
Okay, thanks. And for those, we do have cohorts for each of our issue areas. And so if you do see youth or parent teams that are being led during the GA session, and Emily added that we are providing stipends also for the support of those cohorts too, which I forgot to add earlier. But ultimately moving in a direction where those that are impacted by our policy initiatives are leading the change. So now we kind of go into some of what folks touched on earlier, which is intersectionality, or the concept of trauma-informed care and equity in parallel. So both of these are multi-issue or more multidisciplinary and intersectional issues, which is ultimately what we have been championing for the past 4 years through our campaign. I did add the definition of intersectionality for those who may not be familiar with it, or it may not be at the top of mind, but it's ultimately looking at the categorizations of race, class, gender, looking at how they're interdependent within our systems, and ultimately these identities influence some sort of, are connected to some sort of discrimination or disadvantage in connection with those identities that folks represent. It looks at the ultimate source of oppression, which can be race, it can be class, it can be gender, sexual orientation, religion, ethnicity, ableism, or other identity markers that were represented before in the racial truth and reconciliation goals. And then the lens that Fallon asked about earlier, it's ultimately what we're promoting is an intersectional lens that promotes an understanding of the interwoven disadvantages or prejudices that people face in their daily lives. We're looking at how that influences policy outcomes, regardless of discipline that folks may be here today to represent. And we're looking at the root cause of those outcomes to be preventative, reactive, and responsive when it comes to the intervention. oh gosh, and it looks like this is not the most updated PowerPoint. So we look at racial trauma. It's the race-based traumatic stress. It refers to a stressful impact or an emotional experience that one has dealt with. It could be influenced by racism, discrimination. It could be when someone goes to the grocery store and they're followed because someone's suspicious that they're going to be stealing. It could be police brutality, which we're witnessing in the news. But ultimately, it causes a negative impact on someone's physical and mental health because this is a reoccurring trauma that does not stop. It occurs day to day. Historical trauma, it looks at a specific culture, race, or ethnic group. This could be a major event, like we, for example, often talk about slavery or the Trail of Tears that Indigenous people experience. It could be the Holocaust, but ultimately there is long-standing impacts of this historical trauma that occurred. And this is a shared experience that cultural groups often collectively cope with. And then I'm sorry, but it looks like this is our most updated PowerPoint. But ultimately that weaves into cultural trauma, which is a group that shares similar identities and have both experienced racial or historical traumatic events. And so cultural trauma, culture as a whole is a broad perspective to look at. That can be gender, that can be race, that can be ethnicity. But ultimately, this is a group that shares a collective identity and may experience shared historical and racial traumas that they collectively cope with. So now we'll go into our breakout groups, and I'll pass the mic to our guest speakers. Today we have Michael Royster joining us, as well as Angela Jones. They're going to touch on these two topics, and then after that we'll go into our the breakout groups that we're planning for you today. So I'll first pass the mic to Michael Royster, who will provide a little background on racism as a public health crisis. Michael is joining us today representing the Institute for Public Health Innovation. And I'll go ahead and let him talk a little bit more about himself as well as the organization he represents.
Well, good morning, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Okay, yeah, I see. Okay, great. Thanks for having me, Chloe, and everyone else. I'm excited to be here. As Chloe mentioned, I'm Mike Royster. I'm Senior Vice President of the Institute for Public Health Innovation. We're a nonprofit organization known as what's called a Public Health Institute. There's 40 some odd organizations like ours around the country. Our service area is primarily Virginia, Maryland, and DC, and I'm based in our Richmond office. Our work is based on the belief that all people should have the opportunity to live healthy, thriving lives, regardless of who they are or where they live. And that commitment to equity really defines all our work, whether it's around community health workers, health policy, community health improvement planning, as well as our food systems and equity training and technical assistance that we provide. Prior to joining IPHI, I was the director of the Office of Minority Health and Health Equity at the Virginia Department of Health. Before that, the local health director in Crater Health District based in Petersburg. I've served as president of the Virginia Public Health Association, been an active member of the American Public Health Association, and I'm a physician board certified in preventive medicine and public health. And so I'm excited to join you all this morning at Chloe's request to talk with you about racism as a public health crisis. As some of you may be aware, a growing number of local and state health departments, as well as local and state governments across the country, have made such proclamations in recent months as we've seen the ravages of COVID-19 and police brutality disproportionately affecting communities of color. And so as a public health physician, one of the first questions I ask when I'm analyzing an issue is, what does the data show and why? And so when we look at COVID-19, certainly all of us know from the reports in the press that we see clear inequities in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on Latinx, African American, and Native American communities in Virginia, as well as across the country. In terms of the number of cases that of COVID-19 that we see, the data shows that these communities of color represent about 40% of the population, but 60% of the cases. And neighborhoods that are predominantly communities of color are anywhere from 2.5 to 8 times more likely to have an increased number of COVID-19 cases. And then when we look at hospitalizations, we see that they're about, in some studies, 3.5 times higher among people of color than among whites. And then deaths, again, in some reports, the percentage of deaths among people of color are close to twice their representation in the general population. And these inequities are directly related to the historical and present day context of racist policies in our society that have created and perpetuated segregated, under-resourced communities of color with less access to high quality public education, jobs, housing, healthcare, healthy food, clean air and water, and other social determinants of health, which we know have a tremendous impact on the health outcomes of individuals and communities. And along with explicit and implicit racial bias in employment and education and housing, the result is that people of color are disproportionately represented in many of the jobs that are considered to be essential during the pandemic, but that also place them at greater risk for exposure to infections, such as food processing, working in grocery stores, delivery services, bus drivers, healthcare support positions, such as medical assistants, personal aides, and LPNs. And so the combination of these adverse social determinants of health and racial biases have 2 important effects when we think about health outcomes. First, they predispose people of color to poorer average health and higher rates of disease, which we see in the statistics around diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, asthma, cancer, and others, that also place them at increased risk for complications and deaths from COVID-19. And then second, the distrust and limited access to to high quality healthcare that many communities of color experience create barriers in the prevention and treatment of these other chronic conditions, as well as in terms of the treatment of COVID. Even presenting for care can be a barrier. And so similarly, when we look at this other epidemic that has recently come to light around what I'll call police brutality, we've seen the high profile murders of innocent Black and brown individuals by police, as represented by George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, as well as by vigilantes, as represented by the killing of Ahmaud Arbery. Both of these reflect the impact of racism on health in the most extreme perspective. And if we look more closely at the criminal justice system in particular, we see that a system that's really representative of the institutional racism that's present across all aspects of our society, whether it's in public education, housing, healthcare, early care and education systems, banking and finance, employment and jobs, transportation, all of these social determinants of health. And so in terms of the criminal justice, we know that historically, both white vigilante groups and the police have historically had a role in helping to maintain social order, such that the property and power of economically prosperous whites were protected from the perceived threat of people of color and of poor people more broadly. And so in this context, then when we look at the data, what does the data show? We know that Black and brown Americans who are eventually found to be not guilty are more likely to be stopped by police, especially during the day. They're more likely to be searched when they're stopped. they're more likely to be handcuffed during a search and more likely to be killed even when unarmed. And these are people who are innocent. And similarly, when people of color are more likely to be arrested, we know that they're more likely to be arrested, prosecuted, found guilty, sentenced to prison, and sentenced to longer prison sentences than whites accused of the same crimes, causing generational health, social, and economic effects on families and communities of color. This pattern can be seen again across every sector in our society, although often not as visible and shocking as the unjustified police killings of people of color. Racism within other systems of our society is nonetheless as significant in shaping the access to and quality of social determinants of health, as well as the individual, collective, and generational stress and trauma, which Chloe talked about a little while ago, that have been shown to have the effect on the body's genes and lead to physiologic responses, including increased cortisol, the long-term activation of the fight or flight response within the body, a process which has come to be known as weathering, the early aging of bodies due to that chronic stress, as well as chronic psychological distress. All of these predispose to multiple physical and mental health inequities. And so COVID-19 and police killings of people of color draw attention to the very real health implications of racism across our society. Our efforts to date to achieve health equity have not been successful, primarily because we've not named and addressed the root cause, which is structural and systemic racism. And so racism is indeed a public health crisis, and it must be named over and over again. As Chloe mentioned, that Delegate Lucretia Aird introduced House Resolution 570 this year, and Delegate Haya Ayala introduced House Resolutions 582 for this year's General Assembly, both designed to proclaim racism as a public health crisis in Virginia and to compel action within Virginia Department of Health and across state government. Unfortunately, both resolutions failed to move out of the House Rules Committee, but this effort to name racism must continue, because as a public health expert, I know that in order to address an issue, a public health crisis, we first have to name it and understand what it is. In addition, racism must be addressed through leadership of you all and others across our various sectors, but with community voices guiding the process. By addressing our explicit and implicit biases, both within ourselves and within our institutions, as well as by developing organizational and public policies, practices, and services that acknowledge racism and are intentionally designed to undo past racial inequities and prevent future inequities. Because the most effective way to intervene on a public health crisis is to address it at its root and prevent it from spreading any further. And so it's no longer enough to say that an individual or an institution is not racist. As we know, Trump likes to proclaim that he's the least racist person in every setting that he's ever been in. Yet we know that his words, actions, and policies have been contrary to these statements. While we may not be as extreme as that, if we simply proclaim that we're not racist and carry on our business as usual, we will continue to perpetuate the racism present in our lives, our communities, institutions, and our culture, in effect, making us complicit in the current racist structures. Instead, we must be anti-racist and work intentionally to undo the systems that have led to the epidemic of COVID-19, police brutality, and all the other racial inequities in our society. And I'll close with a quote from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And in that quote, he says, "Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and inhumane. And so it's critical for us to connect these inequities in health to their roots in societal racism if we are to address them effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was great. And I hope a lot resonates with the folks listening on this call today, but also in the future and present as we marinate on that information and those words. Like Michael said, Delegate Lashley's Air did propose a resolution to declare racism as a public health crisis in Virginia, which comes with a lot of different concepts that I don't have at the top of my head. Emily, if you want to intervene, I know you know them by heart. But different working groups to support the intervention of what will come when we declare racism as a public health crisis, such as VDH, looking at biases and policies, et cetera.
I can mention those briefly if you want me to.
Okay. Yes, I don't have it up because I have my share screen on. Go ahead.
Yeah, her resolution, House Resolution 570, would expand the charge of the Virginia Department of Health Office of Equity to address racism as a public health crisis and to ensure statewide policy efforts are analyzed through an intersectional race equity lens and offer funding recommendations. It would retain the commission to examine racial inequity in Virginia law. It would require training for elected officials, staff members, and state employees on how to recognize and combat implicit biases. And it would establish a glossary of terms, definitions concerning racism and health equity, and promote community engagement, actively engaging all citizens on issues of racism, and provide tools to engage actively and authentically with communities of color.
Mm-hmm. I did reach out to her office to see if this is something that they'll again introduce this 2021 General Assembly session, and I'm awaiting more information on that as they examine approaches to the policy, which is what they responded, the information they responded with. Thanks again, Michael, that was great. I will introduce Angela Jones with Richmond Public Schools. Another policy that we're looking at that is quite intersectional in nature is chronic absenteeism, which has been exacerbated by the pandemic through virtual learning. And so Angela Jones will provide more insight about this issue.
So good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Chloe, if you can give me a thumbs up, you're about the only one I can see on my screen. Okay, good, thank you. So good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to join your group this morning. It's just an incredible wealth of information. It's nice to step outside of the school walls sometimes to get some other information. Just quickly, I am, of course, with Richmond Public Schools. I serve as the Director of Culture, Climate, and Student Services, which really means what falls on my umbrella are our school social workers, our behavioral specialists, violence prevention student support specialists, and nursing health services. So a lot of the things that impact our children and families so significantly outside of the classroom falls under my umbrella, because if we don't address those issues, it directly impacts what happens within the classroom. I just kind of want to, I would say I've been in Richmond Public Schools for about 25 years, despite my incredibly youthful appearance, thank you. But I've been here for a long time. I came as a psychologist and have had an opportunity to just see the work evolve in the system. So there are a lot of things I'm incredibly excited about. And then there are things that I continue to stub my toe on that continue to motivate me to continue to come to work every day. I just want to say amen, ditto, and everything to what Michael Royster just shared, because every piece of what he just shared directly impacts the topic of attendance in schools and what's happening in schools. I personally would like to declare absenteeism and attendance a public health crisis in Virginia. Or in the nation, quite frankly. It's something not special to Richmond and what's happening with attendance, and it's not special to Virginia. It's a nationwide crisis, what we're seeing with regard to school attendance. And it's across demographics, although disproportionately impacting families and communities of color, particularly communities that are economically challenged, and all of the other social variables that we know impact all of the other things we've all been talking about. I also want to say that I'm a huge proponent, obviously, of education, because I think it is the leverage changer. It's the lever puller of our communities that can change outcomes for our families and communities monumentally. In addition to the public health, but education is directly correlated with public health. So I'm having a hard time even separating the conversation that we just heard with regard to public health. But I will speak specifically on attendance for a second. Attendance is, the conversation has long been a passion of mine. As I said, I came into the division working as a psychologist. I was traditionally a, what they call one kit, one child, one kit, one kid. I tested kids for special ed, not a very rewarding place to start. I was given the opportunity to start to work in attendance. And so I've been working in specifically, I worked for very specifically in the area of attendance for a multitude of years, and then kind of moved into this director, much more wide open lens to do work with children more holistically. But attendance has always been a passion of mine, because I see attendance, and it sounds almost cliche, but it is truly a symptom of such greater issues and greater challenges that our families are facing. I love attendance because I can use it as the window into our families' lives, where other doors were not necessarily opened due to just years of legitimate distrust with systems, where families would not want to connect with us. And I'm speaking of public education as the specific system in this particular case, but where families may never have engaged with us due to just lack of trust, poor experiences, or what have you. And attendance sometimes gave us a slight little lever to knock on the door and start a conversation and open the door to some other things. Just to keep us all on the same page, just so you know, chronic absenteeism is a term that has been around for a long time, but it became a true marker of measurement for the state just 2 years ago, right? And so I'm proud to say in the city of Richmond, we actually started charting this about 5 years ago. And now it is actually a measurement tool that is used in accreditation purposes, which does cause my face to kind of crinkle a little bit. But it is now one of the measurements that is used for that. But just a norm on what that is very quickly, chronic absenteeism refers to missing 10% of a school year. Any child that misses 10% of the school year is considered chronically absent. And it does mean missing time for any reason. So for years, I worked attendance under the truancy, the traditional truancy officer, the traditional, you're out of school with no reason, now you're in trouble, we're taking you to court, kind of thing, or we're taking you to truancy jail, or what have you. And so we've really opened up the window to say, if a child misses a day out of school, a day out of the seat, and nowadays out of the virtual world, they're missing significant parts of their education. They're missing their significant parts of creating their social network and building those soft skills that we need for life. So any child that misses 10% is considered chronically absent. As we know, I'll speak from the lens of Richmond Public Schools, we are, I am very fortunate that we are blessed with some of the most talented and creative children with such incredible potential and gifts and what have you. But we're also the division that has some of the biggest challenges. So those same creative, blessed, incredibly intelligent children are often not sitting in a seat or sitting in front of a computer at this stage of the game. So we are easily looking at 17, 18% of our kids, and just for context, our division is about 24,000 children. So we're looking at upwards of 3.5 thousand children who are out of school chronically absent. What does that mean? You miss 10% of a school year, you are approximately 30% less likely to ever finish high school. And this happens if you are missing it as a kindergartner or as the 12th grader. Either way, it doesn't really matter when this stuff happens, when this kind of chronic absenteeism happens. We know that kids who are chronically absent 1 year tend to be chronically absent another year. You do this 2-3 years along your educational lifetime, you are 70-80% less likely to finish school. If we apply those statistics to what I just gave you, 3,000 kids, we are in what I call a public health crisis. We're on the train to drop out, right? And a lot of this, again, I said this is across the board. So if you are a family that is very well, if you have a lot of resources, if you're a very well-resourced family, you're at risk as well, even if you miss some school, right? But if your whole background and your access to mitigate those losses looks different than someone else's who lives in a not so resourced area, you can mitigate those losses and come out on top after all. Where in a lot of the families with whom I work don't have that foundation of resource to cover those losses when they do miss time, even when it's not their fault. And I will say this, so when we were looking at chronic absenteeism, we start looking at some of the reasons, right? So gone are the days when I started this, 15 years ago, the new Air Jordan was released and we knew we could capture a whole bunch of kids at Foot Locker on Wednesday at 10 a.m. when it was being released, right? And we go capture the kids, go send them back, go back to school, blah, blah, blah. Gone are those days. We are looking at kids who are missing a lot of school on each day because of a lot of the challenges that our basic society and cultures are facing. And I'm saying this, I am very purposely not saying COVID right now, because this was a challenge for us long before COVID hit. COVID has sent a whole nother level to it, obviously, and I can touch on that in a minute, but I just really want to keep the context that this was an issue before there was a COVID, and it was serious before there was a COVID. And so much of it is so deeply rooted in our cultural and racial traumas and the policies that exist. The reasons that we're looking at for kids missing school: sickness, illness, suspensions. That is a huge amount of time that our kids are missing for out of school suspensions. We have, as no surprise, a disproportionate number of children, particularly males of color with an IEP who are special ed. They are suspended 4 or 5 times more than anyone else in our system, and certainly in our surrounding counties. And I do want to put this out as a note. The people doing the suspension sometimes look just like them. And that's one of the hardest pills that people have had to swallow, is that there's an assumption that a person of color does not suspend another child of color, or that there's inequities there. Inequities are in our belief systems and our foundations and our practices and our rules, and then how those are enforced. And there are studies that show that there are cases where people of color suspend more. And so I just want to keep that on the forefront. But bottom line, we disproportionately suspend based on policies, belief systems, values, norms. We disproportionately suspend more children, particularly males of color, with females quickly catching up. I will say that. So I talked about that. We talked about health, access, transportation. If you are from Richmond and our high school, Huguenot High School that's out, or Bouchard that's on the edges of some of our cities, if you miss your public school bus in a traditional year, to ask a child to hop onto a GRT city bus, have to transfer at least twice to get to school, is asking a whole lot for a family. Or if you're asking for that family to come to school because Angela's gotten in trouble, or you're asking mom to come, or dad or uncle or grandma or whoever that is, the caregiver, we have placed a lot of burdens on there. One of the things that I also wanted to add, as we talked about all the things that impact attendance, that has not been brought up, I don't think, is community violence. And that is very specific to I'm speaking very specifically to the city of Richmond. Community violence, particularly amongst youth. That is another public health crisis in the eyes of Angela Jones. We are experiencing an inordinate amount of violence that directly, obviously impacts public health outcomes, social outcomes, all of those things, impacts our daily school attendance, even in the virtual world. But we are, one of my other jobs is to actually track with the police department how many times our kids are involved in violent act that involve guns or what have you. And just since July 1st, I think at my last point of record, we were at near 30 kids who have either been shot or, and then we've lost a few in that. For every child that's shot, the ripple effect of the kids it impacts and the families that it impacts on the block, on the next block, and those kids often are terrified. They don't come to school. They're scared to come to school. They're scared to react or even show reaction. I never say that our kids are not reacting. When I hear people say that they're numb, it's not true. But they've figured out a different way to respond, which is often withdrawing from the greater world around them, which has increased our attendance rates, increased our absenteeism rates. I'm so sorry. The last one I want to touch on is health, and because we've talked about that a lot. But we in the city of Richmond particularly are particularly plagued with asthma amongst our children. There are a ton of health concerns. We have been very fortunate, as I heard some of the other budget updates earlier in the presentation. We were very fortunate that we had a mayor and a superintendent who this year was able to get us 11 more registered nurses in our schools this year, because schools tend to be the primary health providers for our families. Our kids suffer from asthma. We are the second highest city in the nation for hospitalizations for asthma among children. And so I just want to throw that out there. The other thing is I want to add for health is the equity of treatment. So because, you know, in many ways, we are a very well-resourced city. We have a lot of opportunities for families to engage with services. So it would appear if you looked on paper, but access is not truly access all the time. And because I can pick up the phone and call my child's pediatrician and get an appointment today, doesn't mean that that's the same situation for all of our families. I'm dealing with families now who, because they are public health, I will say this, it's taking three months to get an appointment to see their pediatrician. There's something drastically wrong with that. And then we can talk about the other social determinants that are listed and that Michael already covered. Here's what we do know. If we don't address this and don't address the underlying issues that are driven by race, money, and all those other determinants we've talked about, we know we're on a train for dropouts. We're on a train for creating children who make poor decisions that have very harmful and destructive endings. We know we are looking at children with stunted potential because our children have incredible potential, but many of the doors end up shut because they're not in school. And then we're just looking at just an overall negative outcome for our community at large. I think I will stop there because I know we have to actually have time for something else. But but I would just say this. I just know that we can turn this around. There is a shift in this. There are ways. It is systemic, multi-agencies involved. There's not a single answer. Because in all of this, I never talked about quality education and how important that is. And that is a whole nother, you know, once we have our kids there, we want to be able to provide them a quality place to learn. Like our, so I'll stop with that.
So that was great. It's so, I mean, you're so passionate advocate for students and children. I just wanted to add some context of why we were thinking about this conversation in light of the legislative session too. And we keep hearing from elected officials, policymakers, you know, with these questions of what happens when kids aren't showing up in virtual school? What happens? What are we going to do? What are we going to do to reach out? And so we wanted to have this conversation about what are the underlying issues with chronic absenteeism and how multi-layered it is, so that we can be prepared when bills come up during this legislative session, that we can have a more expansive conversation and more opportunities to propose solutions to that. So that I just wanted to add that context of why have this question now. We don't propose that there can be all it's a sweeping issue, right? Like all of these other things. There may not be one proactive bill that we propose this year, but we'll definitely be looking at the responses to that to get everybody moving in this direction of additional resources for students and communities and schools, and to be able to better address these issues too. So just wanted to add that for thinking of the context here. And so I'll switch it over. We wanted to do breakout sessions, but we're doing that. I think we'll have not enough time to fully get into breakouts and back. So wanted to have folks pose any questions to Mike about your reactions to the racism as a public health crisis as our role as child advocates, or the role of attendance and chronic absenteeism as our role as child advocates before we tie things up here.
Okay. So if you have any immediate reactions, you can also use the questions on this slide as conversation markers, or if you have any questions for our guest speakers, feel free to pose them. And thanks, Angela and Mike. That was great, very informative, and we could hear your passion.
I have a question for both the speakers. Is there any, and I'm sure there are, but are there any like concrete strategies that are being implemented within other communities or other states that you could kind of direct us to, because these things seem so enormous and so like macro level and like overwhelming in a lot of ways. So, which is, I think, how many people in the world have felt, in the last several months with all of it. So I think what might be helpful is to give some concrete kind of tangible examples of like how communities can change and what are some ways to start addressing these enormous historical systems that I think could maybe both of you address that.
Well, yeah, thanks for the question. I guess I can start. I'm thinking of a number of ideas to share. Certainly from a public health standpoint, there's, I think, growing number and examples of local health departments in particular across the country that are beginning to frame their work as a health department around addressing racism and other forms of oppression. And there's several that have been involved in this work for a number of years that has spread as well to local governments. But I'm thinking of places like King County, Washington, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Louisville Health Department there. Many of these health departments have really developed an intentional lens on racism and equity, and they focus on internally around training their staff comprehensively on these issues and understanding what they are, and also developing personal awareness around how they, in terms of implicit bias, et cetera. They look at how they partner with communities as well as other organizations and institutions, and then collectively start to think about how do we do our work together differently in a way that starts to really address these root causes of the health inequities that we're experiencing. A great resource is actually healthequityguide.org, which is a compendium of many of these practices that health departments are involved in across the country. And those same kinds of approaches could be applied in other sectors as well. And then there's tools around how to effectively engage and participate equally with communities to really have community-led efforts to address some of the root causes. And there's tools that are increasingly being used that we refer to as like an equity impact review tool, where you might look at a policy and analyze it from the standpoint of how it affects communities of color and other marginalized groups. And then the goal is to make changes to how that policy is developed or implemented so that it doesn't have any unintentional negative impacts. We've, in some of our training and technical assistance work with particularly in the early childhood setting, we've worked with a number of state coalitions to use that tool, that type of tool, to analyze, say, their universal screening for developmental delays and how they develop that and implement that across their state. Some of the coalitions are looking at strategies around linking farms to early care and education settings to have access to healthy foods. And they've started to use these tools to analyze those policies and systems changes. So there's a number of ways that I think communities are starting to do this work, but it really starts with that awareness, that collaboration is led by communities, and then intentional policy and systems development that really looks at what are the historical contexts in which we live that has created these inequities, and then how do we look at our policy to ensure that it's not reproducing those inequities and is actually helping to undo those inequities. So hopefully that's helpful as some examples.
Thank you again for that as well. I would say there are a number of initiatives and starts and stops and, to address chronic absenteeism or all of the underlying kind of issues with regard to impacting children engaging in education. I would say we would look at, say, Baltimore Public Schools. Boston Public Schools has a big model up there that they're using. Chicago. But one of the common things, though, with all of those models is the collaboration. I think that again, that Michael just spoke of, the community collaboration with regard to bringing all of the agencies and systems together, because they all are at some level impacting what's happening with our children and families. Things are not happening in vacuums and in isolation. Obviously, or often we'll identify one problem that leads to another challenge or another opportunity or another, and making sure that we're all speaking the same language and speaking from the same sheet of paper. And that's some of the things that they've done, really working on in like Baltimore Public Schools, as well as infusing some of the community things into the educational system. So there's more of a seamless line. So if we're looking at restorative practices or social emotional learning, it's not just for the kindergarten or the preschooler, that's something we're infusing through all of our practices all day long. So that's something that we push home into the community or and give parents and family members and community members a voice with that as well. So I would say that it's really about the collaboration and bringing all voices to the table. I would also add, because I didn't speak a lot about COVID in what we talked before, COVID is also allowing us the opportunity to bring some different partners to the table, right? And so when people were forced in our location to start to notice, there really are segments of this city that have no access to broadband or to the internet. And you can't turn your back on that when you have 25,000, 24,000 children. And, so we're forcing some people who didn't naturally find themselves at the community education table before as being valuable members. And I think anytime you can expand your network and give people a purpose and a reason, and you kind of force them to see what's going on, it helps open up some of that. And that's not just here, we're seeing that in other places. There was a big conversation about that in New York City. That's too big to even take on. But anyway, I think it's the spirit of collaboration and speaking the same language, and much like Michael said, looking at your policies to make sure that you're implementing fair, equitable things.
Thank you.
I also saw some folks in the chat referencing the value of home visiting as a specific strategy to that idea of the relationship between a coach or advocate for the family and the child, and the connection to some community systems. Laurel or Ali or Christy, I think, all referenced the home visiting continuum.
And I just comment, we have a team in addition to, in the school division, new this year, which was kind of hard because we weren't planning to set this off on a virtual world, but we're doing it. We have a team of family liaisons, about 23 of them, as well as our team of social workers. Another place we got to grow this year. I didn't get to brag about that, but we added 9 full-time social workers this past school year. And so we're up to about 43 school social workers in addition to the 20 but they are charged, although we are virtual, those who are comfortable, I need to be clear on when I say that, are going out into the communities, and we are conducting what we call porch visits, where we're visiting on the front porch or what have you, the stoop, the front, the curb, whatever, wherever we are finding our families, because obviously for COVID, we aren't going into homes. And I don't want to undersell the number of teachers who are doing this on their own time as well, but that there is that kind of grassroots, I don't care how many computers, cell phones, smartphones that we have, that human connection people are striving for right now and are hungry for. But you're absolutely right. The significance of those visits, of one, here saying you're not afraid to be in the community. I will meet you where you are. I want, you know, I hope you welcome me in your home as much as we want to welcome you in our homes of the schools. And just, it's a whole different vantage point, and it is extremely, extremely valuable and important to start there. And understanding that engagement doesn't have to always happen at the door of the school. Engagement happens wherever you are. It's in the spirit, not in the location.
Angela, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add, to build on that from the public health perspective, we've been very involved in the field of community health workers for a number of years, who are another form or type of home visitors who, you know, are from the communities where they serve, and have, you know, played a critical role in engaging communities that have been marginalized for a number of years in a number of ways, and improving health outcomes. In particular, with COVID-19, we've been working with the Fairfax County Health Department on their response, and have hired over 70 community health workers that are going to people's homes, and particularly among communities of color, immigrant communities, et cetera, that may, you know, really be marginalized from care and resources during this time, and providing that social support, linking them to resources to help them, especially if they're folks who have either tested positive or been exposed to someone with COVID-19 and they need to stay at home for an extended period of time. So that's been like a critical resource as well, to help manage the challenges and barriers that communities of color face. While, you know, I think our approach also is to think about how do we support people where they are, and then also look at those root causes and help to change those systems and policies that created what we have today in the first place.
I just wanted to ask Ms. Jones a quick follow-up. Did you say that those home visits that you guys have been doing, is that has that been since COVID you've started implementing those, or was that a strategy even before? And what impact do you see those visits having? Do you identify families or students who are kind of in that at risk because of so many days missed or something like that? Or how are you determining what families you really how do you triage, I guess?
Sure. It is a practice we had in place before, but I would say we significantly stepped up the game since COVID. And quite honestly, we even repurposed some of our staff. For example, we have 60 school security officers that needed work with our schools closed. We retrained them to go out into the communities to check on some basic door knocking, one, to make sure you're engaged. Do you know how to turn on the computer? You know, those kinds of things. And so we have stepped up the game, and we'll continue to step up the game. And then we do, yes, triage. So if we are, particularly right now, if we're using, say, our school security, and I'll just use them as though they're a large group, who we would consider the less trained for the more difficult kind of social needs cases, we have them for visiting homes that may just need help getting logged on, or may have low absences or what have you. And then we kind of, our family support, and then our social workers based on numbers of days. And really we're using attendance right now as our trigger point, unless a parent calls with asking for help specifically. But those are kind of what we're using as our trigger points. And so our more intense needs for our children who've already missed 20, 30 days, those are straight up our social workers, or our more significant partners. Child Savers is working with us for some of those same children. SCAN is working with us to help keep our teachers beefed up to help work with with families who are challenging. I mean, that's been incredibly powerful work. So we are triaging kind of based on those kind of first level descriptors that we can see. Very difficult in a virtual world.
Oh, so Leanne, I'm not sure if you want to try to unmute yourself, Leanne Lytle with Petersburg.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, you can hear me?
Uh-huh.
Oh, all right. So I was just sharing, I was getting ready to write to you, Emily. In Petersburg, a lot of what they're doing this year is digging into the data. And that's one of the questions I had asked Angela, was just how important you've seen quality data to be in your response to chronic absenteeism, both before and during the pandemic, just because there's, I mean, just like anything else, there's prevention and intervention levels for attendance. So what I've seen as the best prevention measures are really having a good school culture. And then, as she kind of intimated earlier, quality instruction. So school culture and quality instruction are important because that's how you engage the students in the first place. But then when you're looking at the intervention pieces, that's where your data is really important, because you need to know where, you know, if you have your kids who are chronically absent, is it because of transportation? Is it because of health? What is it? You know, we had when the Children's Cabinet kind of planted us in Petersburg with our work group structure of student health and well-being, out of school time, school culture, all of these issues that we know address absenteeism, and doing that work in Petersburg was really important. But we haven't seen, through the work of the partnership anyway, we haven't seen any changes in the chronic absentee numbers. But I think it's because we weren't looking at a lot of that data. And this new administration is really digging into that data to be responsive to the need. But they're also digging into school culture by embracing social emotional learning and making that mandatory, and also bringing in trauma-informed trainings for all of their staff. And so really trying to shift that culture. And now in COVID, like what you were saying, Angela, is, you know, they're also doing kind of those home visits, and their teams are going out, same as you know, that's really kind of a best practice. And it is now, and it was before, and it will continue to be a best practice for engaging families and building that trust between the school system and those families. So this was just a few of the thoughts, Emily, since you asked me to kind of talk a little bit. That's all I have, though.
Thanks. I think I do want to be mindful that we're approaching 11:30, and this has been a really good conversation to hear about some of these issues. I do want to encourage you all to keep these conversations going. Chloe, I can't remember if the last slide has Angela and Mike's contact information, or if we need to put that in the chat for our folks that want to connect with them and keep the conversation going. I will say, for me, what I've heard today in terms of, oh, thanks, Mike. He put his info in the chat. What I've heard today is, you know, we've found there's no one size fits all solution for kids in these situations. We need to be rowing in the same direction. And I think where we are headed as advocates for kids is in the same direction of moving upstream, moving to prevention, putting supports in the communities, and equipping parents to be their the factors of resilience and for their families. And so what I see as today as being able to see how some of these pieces fit together, even if we're calling one thing the school to prison pipeline, or chronic absence, or racism as a public health crisis, or trauma-informed care. They're really different phrases to get us to move into that same direction about preventing the trauma from occurring and shifting how our systems respond to these things. And so I think that as we move forward, the policies that we can interact with, the ways that you all at the community level are able to address these policies through your trauma networks are going to continue to be a really important role of putting all of these pieces together. And, you know, sometimes we pick different labels based on how they play politically, like the school to prison pipeline or trauma-informed care. And so we might have to make some of those decisions about the calling the thing what plays the most politically, but we know that we're all moving in that same direction. I So that is what I heard today, definitely from folks, is that there's a lot of momentum of moving in the upstream direction of providing more resources where they need to be, rather in the front end rather than the deep end. It's just getting our lawmakers to see that too. So these conversations that you're having, have them where they fit in, right? When the topic comes up as absenteeism, or the topic comes up as racism, as public health crisis, or the topic comes up as trauma-informed care. We can all be providing the same ideas of how we can better equip our communities and families, and dismantling some of these systems that have created trauma. So hopefully, folks, we will try to wrap it up since we have hit 11:30 here. Thanks so much to the speakers. Thanks to you all for being able to share your thoughts today. Don't forget, if you want to pop in again on the participating in the advocacy days during the General Assembly session, that's your opportunity to share how these issues impact your work at the local level. I would love to make sure to lift up those experiences too. Yes, so more to even dig in on the SROs, Angela and Christy, you're having that conversation too. Part of that, system of where we prevent things from happening, rather with solutions up front rather than sort of reactions in the deep end of things too. Chloe, do you have anything else to wrap up here?
I don't, but feel free to email chloe@vakids.org if you have any questions about the Advocacy Day or any other initiatives that Voices is engaging in. And just thank you for the fruitful conversation. And I wanted to extend a thanks to our presenters too, as well, for shedding some light on these cross-cutting issues.
Thank you all. Pass on the information about the advocacy days. Pay attention. We'll be coming out with more information. The deadline for the governor to propose his budget is December 16th. We'll be looking at what's included there. And the legislative session starts January 13th, in the continuation of a year of advocacy and policymaking that never ends. So even though it starts then, don't anticipate it's going to end anytime in terms of our role in advocacy and policy. So thank you all for being willing to lend your voices to those conversations too. Okay. Bye.